Should I switch to Linux? Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Yep, let's get right into the question which I'm sure many people have been asking. I give up. Between Windows 8, Windows 10, and now Windows 11, I'm done. What do you think if I convert to Linux, or am I wasting my time? What applications and utilities are compatible? Browsers, anti-spyware, virus protection, etc. How would you go about setting the computer up? I have moderate experience utilizing forums and sites like yours when encountering major problems. Linux is a great way to extend the life of older computers. This is something we actually have talked about a fair amount. Mostly because there are Linux distributions out there, and I'll talk about what distributions are here in just a minute, that are specifically designed to be less resource intensive. In other words, they're specifically designed to work on older machines with less RAM and less powerful CPUs. But if you're tired of Microsoft, if you're tired of Windows, if you're just frustrated with whatever it is that frustrates you about that ecosystem, Linux can be a valuable and a viable alternative. But as with all such things, it depends. It depends on your expectations. It depends on what you use your computer for. And it depends on your own willingness to embrace change. Because as similar as Linux can be to Windows, it's still different. So one of the first things we need to do is talk about exactly what Linux is. Linux is not an operating system. By that I mean you don't go to a shelf or to a download site for Linux. There are in fact distributions of Linux. They're sometimes or most commonly referred to as distros that you do get. They are all Linux, but they are all ever so slightly different from one another. Sometimes not so slightly. Sometimes they are purpose-built for, like I said, resource-constrained machines or other general purpose scenarios. So there are many distributions, hundreds of distributions of Linux. So where you might have one version of Windows, Windows 10 or Windows 11, you might have hundreds of versions of Linux distributions. There are two that people typically point to, and I do the same, for folks that are just getting used to the Linux environment. Linux Mint and Ubuntu. These are two distributions of Linux. They are very similar, but they are also architected and targeted in such a way as to probably be the most useful for the general purpose computer user. Both of these allow you to choose between different user interfaces. So for example, in Windows, you get Windows. You get the start menu for whatever it is in Windows. You get the look and feel for whatever it is in that version of Windows. With Linux, typically you have an option of one or two or three different user interfaces in front. The one that I will generally recommend, and the one that we're looking at right now, is Linux Mint, the Cinnamon edition. Cinnamon is the name of the user interface. There are others, but I'll focus on those for the duration of this discussion. So we do need to set some expectations appropriately. There are a couple of important ones that I think Windows users need to know about. How often updates happen and how long your version of Linux will be supported. Different distros update at different rates, but by and large, they update more or less, I'll just say, continuously. Whereas in Windows, we're used to Patch Tuesday, a once-a-month bundle of updates that are delivered all at once, excepting, of course, occasional what they call out-of-band updates for high-priority security issues. Linux doesn't do that. Most Linux distributions, like I say, distribute more or less continuously. If we take a look here at the update manager, you'll see that my system has an update. I installed this system the day before yesterday, and it already has an update to, in this case, the Linux kernel. The kernel is the core. It's the piece of Linux that makes Linux Linux. The things that are on top of that are some of the other things that get updated, but this is a new Linux kernel for this installation. And like I said, I downloaded it fresh from the Linux Mint distribution site 2 days ago, installed it clean, and within 2 days, I've got another update ready to go. I have seen Linux get updated multiple times per week, almost continuously. If that is something you are not comfortable with, well, Linux may not be for you. Now, before you jump on that statement, it is very possible to just not take the updates. You'll notice that I didn't find out about these updates until I went to the update manager. There is little harm, if you will, in not taking the updates. There may be security issues, just like there are in Windows, but because Linux is such a smaller target these days, they generally don't necessarily affect you and me. Yes, you should take updates. You should take them regularly, but you don't have to take them every day. When I take a look at the updates that my machines, my Linux machines, are getting on a daily basis, they are often for things that I'm not using or that I'm not using frequently, so there's actually no harm in just sort of letting it sit for a while. So one thing to consider is to perhaps schedule yourself up once a month Patch Tuesday, where you go and you run the update manager and install the updates that have accumulated in the prior month. It's up to you. You may get notified that updates are available. That's great. But you ultimately are in control and can choose whether or not to take them. There are updates that will require that you reboot the machine, just like Windows. That's the nature of operating system software. We wish it were otherwise, but that is the way it is. In fact, this Linux kernel, for example, that's being installed here, it's possible that if I were to take it right now, I might need to reboot the machine when I was done. I'm not going to do that. The other thing that people are often concerned about is what I will call life cycle. Many people are distressed when they hear that their edition of Windows has an end of support date. Well, I got to tell you, if the duration, the length of time that Windows is supported is something that annoys you because it's not long enough, Linux may not be for you. Linux is generally distributed in two forms. Normal releases are generally supported for 2 years. Long-term releases, or LTS, long-term support releases, are supported for 5 years. Honestly, right about now, the length of time that Windows is generally supported is starting to look pretty good because it's almost always way more than 5 years. The other thing that is important to understand is that, again, this varies depending on the distribution, but when you do a major update, say from Windows 8.1 to Windows 10 or Windows 10 to Windows 11, it's an upgrade. You can do it in place. Generally, when everything's working, all of your software is preserved, all your installation is preserved, your data is all preserved. It's an upgrade process. For Linux, the small daily stuff, even the updates, I think between normal releases, are generally that kind of upgrade, but the major ones are not. The major ones are frequently install from scratch kind of updates. And that too is something that may or may not concern you. Now we have to talk some about Linux applications. It's very important to understand that Windows applications will not run on Linux. Now, I know that a bunch of Linux users are going to jump on me for making that statement because there are technologies available specifically designed to make Windows applications run on Linux. My experience with those technologies is, I'll just say, less than stellar. Yeah, they work for some applications, absolutely. They work slowly for some applications, and they work not at all for other applications. Since we're talking about introducing people to Linux, potentially for the first time, the correct solution, honestly, is to Embrace Linux-specific applications. Make the changes that you need to change in order to truly use Linux as Linux and not try and cobble Windows applications in Linux. If you ever do get to a point where you need to do that, a better solution might be to run Windows in a virtual machine within Linux. In other words, envision on your screen right now a window that had Windows 10 in it. That way you could run your Windows applications and they theoretically would run just fine. But there are ways to make Windows applications run natively in Linux. I do not recommend it, and especially if you're just starting out, I would be very concerned that the experience trying to get those things to work would probably turn you off of Linux, and I'd rather have you have a good experience with Linux. So what does that mean? Well, applications fall into different buckets. There are applications that are the same. For example, many applications you might already be using have Linux equivalents. Thunderbird and Firefox are two very obvious examples. Firefox exists for Linux. Thunderbird exists for Linux, and it's the exact same tool. Platform changes, of course, but it's the exact same tool that you might be familiar with on Windows. There are applications that are alternatives. For example, if you're a Microsoft Office user, yeah, you could use Microsoft Office Online in Linux, but the alternative applications that you would actually install are things like OpenOffice or LibreOffice. Those are the same, only different. They perform the same functions, but the user interface is different. They do the same things. They have the same concepts, but they go about it potentially in different ways. They also occasionally have compatibility issues, specifically if you're trying to exchange documents in high fidelity with Microsoft Office users. But if those aren't issues for you, then those are alternative applications that sometimes come pre-installed on Linux and are certainly available to install on Linux. And finally, there's the third category of missing applications, applications for which there really is no direct alternative, in which case you may need to find a different approach to the problem, perhaps an online-only offering, or perhaps a completely conceptually different tool that might help you accomplish whatever task that is. So what it really boils down to is that what matters is what you are going to need, what you are going to expect, and what your demands are going to be of your computer. The good news is that if we go take a look at the software manager, this is the kind of the equivalent of the Microsoft Store or the App Store on your mobile devices. This is what makes a bunch of different apps, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications available to you for essentially a 1 or 2 click installation. And the vast majority of them all are free. So if you wanted Minecraft, if you wanted FileZilla, if you wanted Skype, or gparted actually is one of the tools that I often will run it for Linux for. It's a disk partition utility. Those are all here and ready to install. WhatsApp, ready to install. And like I said, there's lots and lots of different categories. These are just the editor's picks right now. If we were to take a look at Office tools, now we get things like LibreOffice, a text editor, other tools that you may or may not be familiar with, but you get the idea. There's a lot to explore here. Next, Linux hardware support. This gets interesting. Because Linux is an open source system and most open source licenses require that the source code for anything be made available for examination and available even for modification in some cases, many hardware manufacturers don't make drivers for some of their hardware available on Linux, specifically because they don't want to expose what would for them be trade secrets. So hardware support in general is good. The popular video cards, the popular machines, by and large, most of what the average user is going to need is going to be supported. Where we start getting into the weeds are two things. Esoteric or less common hardware may not have any support, And hardware that is supported may be supported by generic open source drivers that actually don't have all of the extended functionality that might be available should a real driver, say in Windows, from the manufacturer be available. So hardware in general is very good, but there are going to be places where Linux kind of sort of misses the mark simply because the drivers or the functionality that's required to make the device act to its full capability isn't necessarily there. Linux user support. This is an area where I have very, very mixed feelings. It's better than it was. Linux support is generally peer-to-peer, which means you will go out and you will find a discussion forum about your favorite version of Linux, the version you happen to have installed, and you will find other users of that distribution there discussing their problems, their solutions, their whatnots. These forums, and again, this varies a lot depending on the distribution, can have a reputation for being hostile, user unfriendly, which is really kind of sad because it does get in the way of Linux adoption. It is one of the biggest reasons I think some people give up in frustration. To stack the deck in your favor, when you interact on those forums, obviously, be polite. If you're frustrated, let that, set that aside. Be as polite as you can, but most importantly, be as clear as you can. Follow the instructions. Read the answers that people give you. Don't react, just act. Read the instructions, follow the instructions that you can. Ask questions, again, politely, if you don't understand what you're being told. Where forum participants get the most frustrated is when people asking questions don't follow directions. They don't read the available information. They don't follow the instructions that they were given. They don't take the time or the responsibility to learn about the operating system that they've chosen to start using. So don't be that person. Be clear and complete and respectful, and chances are you'll have a good experience on those forums. But like I said, if you're not, they're the kind of forums that can actually turn pretty quickly and can turn you off of using Linux at all. Like I said, I feel bad saying that, and I'm honestly hoping that things are getting better over time, but I've just heard it too many times to be able to say anything other than beware. Be cautious, do it, but just be cautious. So you want to give Linux a try. What do you do? Well, the good news is that for most Linux distributions, you actually don't need to install it right away. What you can do is you can download what's called a live edition of the operating system. Most distributions, or at least many distributions, will have this available. What it is something that you would burn to a DVD or write to a USB and then boot from that DVD or USB. Once you've done that, it will boot into a copy of that Linux distribution just running. It's not an installer, at least not unless you want it to be. It's actually a version of the operating system up and ready to go. It'll have some installed options. It'll have some installed applications. You can play with it. You can see what's different about it. You can see what you like or don't like about it. The only thing to be aware of is that depending on which approach you've taken, performance may not match what would actually happen if you had installed it. If you choose to install it, don't yet. Instead, go back to Windows, make an image backup of your machine, a complete image backup, so that in case later, after installing Linux, you change your mind, you have something you can go back to without too much hassle. Then, after you've created that image backup, boot once again from that live installation media or that live media, and you'll see that on the desktop will be an installer, and it'll say, install Linux, and it'll proceed to, when you install it, overwrite Windows, and when it's done and your machine reboots, you'll be running Linux. So I hope that gives you an opportunity to at least consider what this is about. Like I said, Linux is an area for which people have lots and lots of opinions, and that's fine. You'll probably see it in the comments on this article or on this video. But the bottom line is that I do think that for a lot of people, Linux can be a very, very viable alternative if you're willing to take the time to learn a little bit about it, experience it, look for the alternatives for the applications that you're used to using, and enjoy it. It is generally free, it's generally well maintained, and to be honest, to be even more honest, whenever you're visiting askleo.com, you're actually accessing an Ubuntu Linux server. Yep, askleo.com lives on Linux, and I've used it for many, many years for that purpose. So give it a try. I hope this was helpful. I hope this gave you some things to think about. For updates, for related links, for a bunch of footnotes and more, visit askleo.com/3222. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.